Cracks and Pomo will be releasing a zine featuring a variety of writers, some of whom have been featured on this podcast. To order a copy or to make a contribution to our funds, please DM at Cracks and Pomo. Okay, so we're back at Cracks in Postmodernity with Matthew Donovan, who's a student at Columbia and also co-host of Neoliberal Hell podcasts. Matthew, thank you very much for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Stephen.
So we're currently at the Hungarian Pastry Shop, very famous place. If you haven't been here, you definitely should come here at some point. And we're going to discuss this essay you wrote, The Ambient Polity, which is to be published soon. But for people who are unfamiliar, just give a little bit of background, like what are you trying to address in this essay? What are you trying to say? Give us a brief idea.
So I can give you kind of the genealogy of the article maybe later, but as a summation, it's just basically about how politics itself has basically been something that is no longer accessible, just like the idea of us accessing who we are, and a society that is increasingly run by automation, artificial intelligence, and basically as this technology speeds up, human creativity and selfhood is replaced by autopilot culture that runs without any intervention from humans.
Yeah, so I think what's interesting here in the beginning, you're talking about this concept of the hyper-political, which is brought on by, the pervasiveness of virtual reality. So, I would say, as Weber would say, the disenchantment or, the uprooting from the real, from the material or the concrete, and how it kind of disperses, the options for political engagement, political discourse that we have. So, give us more of a sense of the dawn of this disenchantment, this fracturing, as you say, and how it turns us into this hyper-political position.
Yeah, I think this foundation is really important, so I'm glad we're starting there. So basically, at the turn of the century, humans are moving to urban cities, and the disenchantment comes from the ever-awareness of how industrialization and urbanity has led to people being more and more separated. When we move to cities, we all of a sudden are in this competition of individualism and intellectualism, and this pervasiveness of division leads to a sense of alienation as well. And so the internet era is actually a concentrated version of this, where schismogenesis, the process that sociologists talk about, where we have to kind of divide ourselves from everyone around us, speeds up. So individuals continue to be hyper-fractured in ways that they've never been before, as basically information processes and concentration of people speeds up. And my summary of this is basically that it actually leads to the loss of any connection to who we are, because we're always being divided, ratioed, and in a political system that's autocratic. So.
Yeah, and I think the other piece of this is that the traditional kind of political categories we have, like left, right, traditional, progressive, etc., it kind of, there's no basis for this anymore. Everything is kind of, again, it's uprooted. And now, you say something interesting about the relationship between, perhaps manual laborers, working class, and the professional managerial class, knowledge workers. So, how have we shifted from the old kind of political spectrum to this new one where it's really based on the kind of, the nature of work that you're doing?
Right. So the factory floor, where labor held out on human creativity and had some sense of collectiveness through, labor unions, was slowly supplanted as basically Unions were systematically weakened over the last couple of decades. Labor now has become increasingly precarious, and not only that, labor has shifted to the realm of the cognitive mostly, and so now what were once the precariat are now the cognitive precariat people, and now we live basically isolated from labor itself. And not only that, we're now increasingly seeing less and less ability to create work in the future as artificial intelligence is taking over the cognitive realm.
Yeah, and like that leads to this point you make about like this meta, hyper-aware kind of individual who, I don't know, like you talk about the culture of like post, or like X, Y, and Z core, you know, how it's like, it's I guess what you're saying, like it's a means of coping with the fact that like we don't have any substantial avenues of political engagement to make real changes. So like, I don't know, what do you see here in the manifestations of these niche internet communities, these identities, I don't know, like how is this a reaction to the lack of substantial ways to be involved in social realities?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that when, for instance, Joshua Citarella talks about e-ideologies or e-dologies, e-dologies is how it's spelled online. In some sense, it seems as if these things are new, these kind of prefixes of, Southern, South globalism, monarcho-socialism, these kind of like long abbreviated types of political stances are like new. I think maybe like the giving it the specific language is new, but the hyper division of political categories has long existed. And it was likely less of a performative identity that was, used online. And I do agree with what Stephen's saying. I do think that in some ways that performance has become how we live through like this idea of being political without actually engaging with politics outside, when everything is isolated basically to the online and cognitive realm, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, and I mean, that's the thing I was saying to you before, that like looking at these new niche political communities, whether it's, dirtbag left or like far-right populists, or even like the Catholic integralists, I don't think they have that much substance, honestly. Like they're, these meta-ironic reactions to the emptiness of the mainstream discourse. Like also what I was saying about, I don't know, when I was younger, I didn't really trust legacy media. Like I didn't trust the establishment like most young people. What's different now though is that like there are these actual communities that have platforms that I mean, I wouldn't say they're competing with legacy media. Like Red Scare is not competing with Fox News per se, but there's like a viable like place for people who have these ideas to actually say what they're thinking. And as much as, again, like I said, I think they do lack some substance. They're immature in a way. I do think this is a necessary intermediary step that we need to take, because, like, I don't know, if we look at the vast majority of people who are not spending their whole days online, like the quote-unquote normies, they like to take one of the establishment positions, whether left or right-leaning. I think, like, it's over. Like, it's, as Patrick Deneen said, liberalism has failed in all of its manifestations. So to say that, I don't know, to criticize these niche political communities as being like immature or childish, it's like, okay, but what's the alternative? I think in order to actually start making real headway, we do need to take on this ironic position, this performative position. And this is, this was Wilde. Like, Wilde was insane. Like, Wilde was not a coherent person, but it was through his insanity, through his decadence, that he was actually able to say something very substantial, very truthful about society. So, like,
Yeah, just to kind of round out that point, Zizek talks about how people on the left often watch revolutionary films to vicariously live through the people they're watching. And I think our kind of experiences we have online are a lot of times it's like we live vicariously through either the ideologies or the types of posting that others do. And that proximity gives us a feeling of aliveness and, integration within the greater whole and of society. And if we accept that it's all in the cognitive realm, then we can kind of qualify how political it really is,
Yeah. No, and I want you to say a little bit more about, like, you mentioned Zizek and this concept of the big other and how, this extremely hyper-bureaucratic system that we're in that's brought on by this Weberian disenchantment, the Protestant work ethic, whatever you want to call it. We're always griping about something. There's always we want to point the finger at someone to, pin all of our hardships on. But again, it's who really is to blame? Because things are so virtual, so uprooted, it's nearly impossible to actually pinpoint what is the source of the issue and what concretely can I do about it. So, I don't know, what do you see happening in this, searching for the big other to blame our issues on?
So I guess if you read the essay, a lot of what I'm doing here is just pointing out all the ways in which we are dislocated, disempowered, buried under 1,000 layers of meaning that we can't reach. And in the case of the Weberian reference, the hundreds of layers of bureaucracy that we're all buried under, and the types of change that we want to affect is quite limited by the fact that, as Weber says, we're hard-boring into a type of material that takes, in some cases, decades, to affect that change. And so, the kind of gotcha that a lot of people that are in the kind of dirtbag left or the tradcraft horseshoe kind of say, well, good for you for doing activism. It doesn't do anything. But as somebody that has been part of activism projects, it just takes a long time. And the kind of history and result of this, of progressivism or any of these things, will take several decades. If you think that history moves at a pace of your cognitive desire, it doesn't. History has its own, moving, and the speed in which it's moving is not likely at the speed of Twitter or the speed of the kind of ways that we move nowadays. So accepting that, that history moves slowly is another way of just bringing realism to the kind of reality that we're engaging with. And so even though I'm saying we're disempowered in some ways by this bureaucracy, we're disenchanted. If we accept it, we can have some qualified hope within there, saying okay, so look, AOC is now pro-Ukraine, and, AOC is this and that. And I was never an AOC fan, so I was never disappointed, because I knew that she would be controlled by the vectors of power in history in the same way that Bernie Sanders was, and that she couldn't have even existed without Bernie Sanders, and that all of these projects happening locally across the nation, doing little, really small things, they're not as much as I would like, but I am happy with the little bits of change that we get because I'm a realist.
No, and this brings me to this whole issue of being ironic versus being sincere, cringe versus based, however you want to phrase it. Because, and we can go a little bit into Matty Healy here and the J Tolentino piece. I share with you this piece that I wrote that's going to be published probably tomorrow for Unheard. But basically, what I saw in J Tolentino's take on Matty Healy is there's this tension between being ironic, being sincere, that he's able to maintain in a very, in a way that's really distinct, because, and this goes back to Wilde. Wilde is extremely decadent. Wilde is super artificial, in the campy sense. And it's through that exaltation of artifice, that he's able to point to something that's true, able to point to like nature. It's this capacity for paradox and nuance that I think our like super disenchanted, super Enlightenment style culture has no concept of. So what Healy's doing by like making these super ironic, super outlandish statements is pointing to something that's actually sincere. And I think this is what the whole like dirtbag left, whatever kind of culture is trying to do in a way. Like, you're becoming so apathetic, you're becoming so detached that you open a space to discover like, okay, but then what is real? What actually does matter? And I don't know, like there's again, it's this paradoxical logic that we struggle very much to understand. So I don't know, like I'm interested in some of your thoughts on this tension between being ironic, being sincere, and how it can like, again, like by being super fake, you can point to something very real inadvertently, you know?
Yeah, I mean, if we can connect this to the previous thing about like how history and culture move very slowly, first of all, I think that Matty Healy is downstream from like podcasters basically, and I've joked a lot about how podcasters are the new rock stars, and that kind of proves. Sorry about that. That kind of proves this in a way because he's downstream from. For instance, I Am Pac, who's a New York podcast and who's downstream from Red Scare and like the film industry and the music industry themselves. But I think more or less he's downstream from what is perceived to be kind of the aesthetics and dispositions of, quote, Times Square or Redacted Square. And so... in that way, you know, it's less interesting, you know, to say like, okay, like, well, he's getting all this, pop media attention because of this. And because he's downstream from these other people within the scene are less interested in him. They're more critical of him. But to the wider culture, I think that's really important to pay attention to. Like how this is actually being transmitted to a culture that is outside of this niche scene here in New York. And that's where his relevance comes in my perspective. So slowly people like him are going to be more common. He's going to be kind of like he's putting out the red carpet for all of these other celebrities who might jump on this bandwagon. And then, a lot of the people that are on his side were pointing out Taylor Swift being in a photo with the person that had a Nazi shirt on. This person named AJ, who plays in the band Patriarchy in LA, if you know them. And how even though people are pointing out that is supposedly making her Nazi, for those that aren't aware, that shirt in itself was supposed to be satirical. So instead of it being a gotcha from the perspective of the downtown ironic scene, I'm going to say that one more time because it was honking. Instead of it being a gotcha from the downtown scene to show that, oh, look, Taylor Swift is actually the racist here, it actually just reinforces that irony has, that mode of irony and trolling has long been a part of this culture, even in 2012 when that photo was taken. So.
Yeah, side note, have you ever read I think it was like an article or a soundbite where Camille Paglia called Taylor Swift a Nazi Barbie?
A Nazi Barbie?
Yeah. Have you ever seen that? That was like 6 years ago or something. I don't know.
It reminds me of like the move that like that guy that wrote the book Liberal Fascism kind of made, though, right? Isn't that kind of the same move?
I mean, she was saying how she was making a statement about like WASP middle class white girls and how like they have these followings of fellow girl bosses, and it's like fascistic in a way. I don't know. It was just Camille Paglia being Camille Paglia. It was funny, but
yeah. I mean, it just reminds me of what Jonah Goldberg said when he was talking about liberal fascism. It's like Camille Paglia doing hot takes for hot take's sake, which is great. I mean,
I'm here for it.
Yeah. I mean, in itself, it's like I don't mind people taking down Taylor Swift personally. I don't care.
You like her, like, as a musician?
I don't think there's any redeemable qualities of Taylor Swift as a person or a cultural figure. Weird. Yeah. But I also I find it difficult to find.
Here we go again. It's New York. What can you expect?
But I also find it difficult to find a lot of redeemable qualities in Camille Paglia personally too. Yeah, I mean outside of the hot take industrial complex that she's like a part of, like it's kind of, you kind of said it yourself, like anti-wokeness is in itself just a pop sensibility to reduce the culture war to something that is much simpler than it actually is.
But she's a real scholar though. I don't think we can deny that.
Like Catherine Stockton's a real scholar.
All right. Okay. We're not going to go down this rabbit hole, but we'll agree to disagree. I mean, she's old, though. Like, when is she, like 70, 80?
I just like that, like, she claimed that she was trans at one point, and then that article was, like, scrubbed offline.
Trans in, like, a cosmic sense? That's how I read it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know. No, I don't know, but either way, I think whatever hot take that was would have played really well in today's... I think it actually would have added complexity to the argument. If she was like one of these like right-wing trans people,
Yeah, so we'll leave Paglia for another day. No, but back to Matty. So like what I really loved, first of all, I have to say Gio Tolentino really did a great job here. Really capture like the many facets of his history, his spiel. But there's the point where she asks him about that freelance show appearance, and he's like, none of this matters. Like, why? Like, there's no one should care. The fact that, if you're staying up late at night worrying about what Matty Healy said, either you're mentally ill or your priorities are extremely out of order. So it's like and of course, like this soundbite, everyone's freaking out over this. Like, I'm seeing this all over Twitter and Instagram. But if you stop and think, it's like, okay, this is this form of meta-ironic, decadent performance art, which is trying to say, like, sure, what he said was ridiculous. It was immoral. But by doing that, he's highlighting, wait, aren't we all kind of immoral? Aren't we all kind of messed up and need to reevaluate, like, what am I living for? What are my priorities? And then he goes to say, like, what really matters to me is not how politically correct I am or whatever, but like, how is my mother doing? Do I need to take better care of her? Like, who are the people I need to be spending my time with? So it's like, by going to this one decadent extreme, you're shedding light on what actually does matter in the end, which our hyper political correct culture tends to downplay the importance of,
Yeah, I mean, I think he kind of, he lost a great kind of opportunity there to educate people about the problems of PC culture in a way that's more meaningful. Like, because if we were to take what he said at face value, we shouldn't care what Matty Healy says. Would that mean that he's not going to sell at Madison Square Garden because we don't care about Matty Healy at all? Or is he no longer going to be a celebrity? I think that he does care, actually, about what people think deeply. And it's usually people that are deeply obsessed with how people perceive them that a lot of times continue to stay in the limelight, because they basically monitor their projection into the world more than others, and have a team of people likely that coached him on what to say and all of this. And so they're pivoting to the personal. He's saying, like, well, I'm just a regular guy. I care about my mom, and you shouldn't think too much about what I have to say. Ignore that I'm a celebrity. But I think what he should have said is that, well, the kind of culture that has given rise to all of these people critiquing me is really toxic. And as much as you think that, like, you're creating progress in culture by, like, monitoring what I'm saying, actually, you're not helping anyone. You're just really playing into this liberal middle class aesthetic of this is acceptable to say and this isn't acceptable. But it affects no real material change whatsoever. He should have said that, in my opinion. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And, like, again, back to Wilde, his, like, extreme forms of decadent immorality and you see this like in Importance of Being Earnest or Lady Windermere's Fan, like by going in this, like he's in this paradoxical way trying to shed light on what true morality is. So by being extremely immoral and decadent, he's trying to hold a mirror up to the culture and say, look, like you Victorian people are so caught up with your morality and you're extremely immoral people. But then this is so, like when I was reading the article though, it also made me think of something that Anna from Red Scare says a lot. She was saying the thing that most like people who are obsessed with political correctness don't realize, because they're mostly people in the professional managerial class, unlike working class people who actually have skin in the game. Like what matters is not performing like you being on the correct side or you being an ally to a certain group of people, but like being a loyal friend, like being, I don't know, having kids and being a parent, like having community, having a faith, whatever it may be. And it like, it's funny because again, people present Red Scare as like, oh, these like decadent, nihilistic, dime square girls. And again, like there definitely is something nihilistic about it in a way. And yet, look at Anna, like she's a mother. She's like, no, not a perfect person, but there's something much more like real about her than these people who are virtue signaling on Twitter all day. And I do think there's an interesting, like, both a commentary on class difference, but also like there's a cultural ethnic difference, because the fact that she wasn't born in America, the way she was raised was not according to this WASP kind of puritanical American mentality. So I don't know, like there's that like working class ethnic sensibility that isn't as puritanical. Like I don't know, like it's, at least growing up around Italian Americans, I see that it's normal to make politically incorrect jokes about people while deep down really loving them. You know, like we're not obsessed about you can't say X, Y, and Z. It ends up becoming a cover for like the fact that maybe you don't really love your friends that much. Maybe you're not as committed as you present yourself on the internet, you know. But that brings me to this other point. So you include this Dean Kissick tweet about this headless position, as he says. And I think in a way this taps into like the dichotomy between the extreme relativism of the moment, that like we can define ourselves however we want, like there's no objective truth, but also again we're stuck on this puritanical morality that like we have to cancel people if they say one thing that's, you know, slightly immoral. So I don't know, I'm curious, like what do you see here in this back and forth between like, you know, anything goes versus like, you know, again, wanting to eliminate someone because they break this speech code or whatever moral standards?
Yeah, I mean, I think we should also kind of, as people who are thinking about this, create like a new positioning for the cancel culture around PC politics. I think 2 or 3 years ago that when people were canceled, it really had some kind of emotional hold to it, but I don't think it really holds as much now, since people like Louis C.K. can sell out Madison Square Garden. It kind of proves that the cancel culture that we imagine in fear in our heads isn't really, it's not playing out in a culturally meaningful way to really stick. And I think if somebody like him, who's, you know, in some ways, he didn't just break speech codes, you know, or speech acts, he actually did something like a lot of what somebody like Anna Khachiyan would probably think is perverted, even though I think they support him still, you know. So I mean, like, there's a little bit of a drift, I think, away from the speech acts thing to like a general culture of just acceptance of people doing things wrong. And I think that's something maybe like where the moral relativism on the anti-woke side has kind of come in as well, you know, where there's like Louis C.K. is associated with Dave Chappelle, even though Louis C.K. was like doing something perverted on the phone or like in front of, you know, somebody in front of him. Dave Chappelle's saying something that is not acceptable, and they're canceled in the same way, right? But as I said, 3 years ago, he would have been canceled. Now we see that basically we live in the era where that cancellation is not sticking. So, I mean, I don't think necessarily that is something to worry about. I think what we should worry about is like how basically the kids that go to the Matty Healy concert now might not go there because they think that he's a bad person. And I think that that's not the correct position. I don't think that anybody would think that kind of dogma is productive. So.
Yeah, and that was, back to Paleo. That was her whole thing with whatever Rolling Stones song where they said something like rapey, I guess. But she was saying, we can hold art to the same moral standard that we would politics or like religion or whatever. Like, art is supposed to be iconoclastic. It's supposed to question the moral norm.
Yeah.
And it goes back to what I was saying to you before, like at least with Chappelle. If we can't laugh as a culture, like if we don't have a sense of humor, we're screwed, because then it's not only that, like, first our culture will be boring if we're not laughing, but also it's this false sense of like it's this idolatry of the self, like, and this is Wilde again with his like decadent trad-cath kind of horseshoe thing, that part of his very Catholic worldview is that he understood that he was a sinner. He understood he was not God, and that means we should laugh at ourselves, because we're like, there's nothing about us humans that we can take that seriously. You can't take a joke, that you can't laugh,
Well, I think for Wilde, it's interesting because he was arrested for basically having sex with somebody's son that was wealthy and powerful. And he wasn't arrested for his art. He was arrested for being somebody that lived openly as, basically, a professional managerial class worker. He was canceled for being openly gay in relation to somebody that had more power than him. So the cancellation thing kind of is the same thing. It hasn't changed. It's often people who, who are likely they have some type of power and they can cancel people. And that's the history of cancellation in general. It's mostly been, aimed at oppressed people for most of history. And now that kind of relationship has flipped a little bit. So like if you were an immigrant, like Anna Kachian, and you were saying something wrong, you're more likely to be canceled as a Eastern European than as a WASP. And so that's kind of a context that we kind of miss because nowadays, somebody from Eastern Europe might not be even considered to be somebody that has some kind of oppression. So,
do you have any thoughts on Junot Diaz, the novelist? Do you know who he is?
I'm aware of who he is, but I'm not aware of his work. Yeah.
Okay, because what you're saying makes me think of him, because it's this Dominican American guy. Needless to say, Dominican men have a very distinct way of conceiving sexuality, mixed gender communication than WASPs do. Take it for what you will, but it's clearly different. And the fact that this guy is canceled for being, a little bit inappropriate. I mean, yeah, there's clearly something problematic, but it's like we're, harping about diversity and dismantling the normativity of white kind of modes of communication and cultural expression. And you have this Dominican guy who's acting the way that he was taught growing up, and you try to destroy his career. It's like, sure, if you're being inappropriate with your students, you should be reprimanded, but where is this sense that the standard we're holding him to is extremely Anglo-Saxon Protestant, extremely puritanical,
Yeah, I'm not aware of the situation, but yeah, I mean, what cancellation often means is just that you don't have access to certain institutions anymore. So when that's aimed at people that don't have as much privilege, it's not really progressive. It's more likely to be just reiterating the kind of past struggles.
Yeah. So I want to move on to getting some of your hot takes. Yes. Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. But sorry, I never answered your question about the headless positions. My apologies. But yeah, I mean, basically, when we basically are, endlessly in this game of creating opinion difference, like we have the most unique perspective, or a game of contrarianism, basically. As Nemesis Global's report, Max Payne says, it becomes a player versus payer environment where each player is basically now becoming so predictably contrarian, so predictably different, that reality no longer has a position within this matrix. And so nobody's reliable anymore. Nobody online's reliable. It's incredible new level of meaninglessness. So.
Yeah, no, and this question of what reality are we referring to? Like when you mention Baudrillard and like virtual versus material, is it this dichotomy, or have there always been multiple planes, multiple facets of reality? So like that's, I don't know, that's definitely something we have to like ask seriously. We can't take it for granted. We know which reality we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, there's always been kind of like really alienated, individualized realities. A serf living in a rural village that has a population in the double digits is likely to have, multiple layers of reality that they're existing within and perceiving, but they can't communicate. And the difference is that now we have just found so many new novel ways to communicate things that had always long existed. But then that form, that communicative act now in itself has been a source of new alienation for everyone else around us, because it's just embroidered with so many levels of performance and fakeness. And so it's like the same thing that happens in academia. People become so specialized that they no longer can communicate with people around them, even though they think they're being hyper-specific. And basically now everyone is enmeshed to the point of constant confusion and alienation and disenchantment. So. And
that links to what you were saying about like the loss of common sense. Like there's no common point of reference anymore in reality. So like this is why people are acting, I don't know, crazy, for lack of a better term.
Yeah,
but
totally.
Yeah. All right. So some hot takes. Let's start with today, the 1st of June, beginning of Pride Month. You have any hot takes on Pride 2023?
Oh, I mean, again, when when gay and lesbian and queer people become recognized in the same way that we talked about how being canceled just means you're canceled in certain institutions, being recognized just means that you are now accepted by certain institutions. And so the same institutions that may historically oppress gay, queer people are now basically the institutions that give a veneer of interest in these people. And so, I mean, even if that history doesn't speak to the meaninglessness of that, maybe the policies that have brought a recognition like gay marriage should, because basically marriage itself is largely a middle-class institution. Marriage does not necessarily mean that everyone can get married. There's still people that are not, that don't have access to that. If people are getting married, I think they should get married to like basically just marry people so they can live in the United States. I think that's the best reason to get married.
I have a prediction. I think so. Like up until now, you see on like let's say on the left, you see this anti-rainbow capitalism kind of performance on the internet. We also see on the right, like, just anti-pride in general. I think we're at the verge of, like, meta-pride now, like, ironic celebration of pride. Because, I don't know, it's like, at this point, I just think it's overplayed to be against, like, oh, rainbow capitalism, like, you're not going to fire rainbow flags on July 1st. And also, like, the neocon reactionaries. I feel like it's maybe this year it's going to start to end, and then it's going to be like, let's celebrate pride, but like in an ironic way that makes fun of pride. I don't know. I don't think anyone it's just cringe. I think it's cringe now to like be against it.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's going to be different ways to celebrate Pride. But yeah, the institution itself is obviously just like for people like children and people that are getting fully kind of integrated into like being accepted. So like since we live in cities, we think about things in like this hypercritical way. Like we think like, oh, like the Gay Pride Bank of America banner saying like we're opening, you know, I mentioned this in the article, you know, we have new interest rates for people who are gay, just proved to us by having gay sex in the lobby or something like that, you know, like that's really liberatory, I'm sure. And so, but the other side of this is that, you know, we exist between multiple temporalities. So like people in rural Mississippi going to Pride would actually have, I still think that would actually be meaningful if they're in certain places where history breaks, you know, like where Pride hasn't existed and it goes there and it actually has some meaningful break with reality. And that kind of break with reality is going to be different for each geolocation. You know, if the next Saudi king started having, had a OnlyFans with all of his gay lovers, like, I think a lot of people would think like, oh, that's very different, you know, than the previous, power relations that existed before. And so, like, we have to, if we are hyper aware, we always have to qualify things within like this. We have to be detached from like whatever political priorities we have and criticizing these narratives, you know. So.
Okay. So next hot take, ChatGPT, which you do mention in this essay.
Yeah. Hot takes on it.
Yeah.
Oh, I mean.
Where's this going?
Yeah, I mean, ChatGPT, I recently was responding to a Nick Cave article about how he was complaining, or he was criticizing ChatGPT or just artificial intelligence for not being able to write a beautiful and creative song. And my response to that was basically that I think ChatGPT, if he used ChatGPT, like worked alongside of it, he could have wrote a better letter. And I think that like the kind of ignorance of these boomers who are obviously very influential on cultural history, they don't really have a place in history anymore, in my opinion. I think this romanticism for humans and human intelligence and creativity and subjectivity is something we will laugh at in the future. I think it's incredibly naive, and I don't actually think he knows how to use ChatGPT. Nick Cave, if you're listening, I have access to ChatGPT 4. I've already wrote several better versions of your letter, and I'm going to be submitting it to Spike magazine. So
excellent. We'll be looking forward to reading it. Continuing on the tech note, TikTok, just TikTok in general. Anything?
Well, I mean, I just like some kind of logistical things. A lot of people have said that like TikTok's going to be made illegal, but my friends at TikTok are telling me actually that it would only be made illegal on like government computers and phones and that kind of thing. It's not a real ban, if I understand correctly. And yeah, we recently did a show in LA where we combined TikTok and Vines. And, combining these two different eras together and just showing how the kind of insanity that we perform online is like the best example of how people rhetorically respond to each other online. Like if you watch these videos and think about those as rhetorical forms, it makes more sense than the words themselves by just looking at the words. And the kind of headless positions that exist in those performative acts are the same things that's happening online.
Is there a substantial difference between TikTok and Vine? Like, I don't know. What do you see there?
Oh, I mean, so I think that TikTok, it hits differently, Vine, it feels like if you look at Vine videos, it feels like much older than it actually is. It feels like it's like a decade or a decade and a half old because of how fast history moves now culturally. But TikTok still hits in a way where like you didn't expect some like a really normie guy to like. There's this one really great video, for instance, where there's this normie guy, and he is sitting across from this girl, and he says to her, "I'm sorry, did you need a pen because they're about to take a test?" And then she said, "Yeah." And then he said, "Do you want my answers to the test?" And she says, "Yes." And then he asked her to study at his house, and she says, "Yes." And then they go there, and the next question is basically, do you obviously like, are you gonna make out? Do you want to make out, or like, are you interested in me? And then he says instead, "I'm so sorry that 9/11 happened." and then she gasps and like is like really shocked, and then he says, "Sorry, that's not 9/11. That's actually just my mom. She's really drunk right now." And then it just turns off. And just like the level of senselessness that makes sense at the same time, where like now we make like our brains make sense of the senselessness and the levels of irony that we wouldn't have during the Vine era. Like it's a little bit more layered, and like so seeing how the kind of slow increase of senselessness now actually makes more sense.
You know what this makes me think of is SpongeBob. Because like so. Here's a little plug. Cracks and Pomo the zine is coming out in like a little less than a month, and one of our writers did an article on this, on like the absurdity of SpongeBob. And I think SpongeBob like primed our generation, well, several generations actually, for what was coming in the like Vine, Instagram, TikTok era. Like this total absurdity, which makes absolute sense to us. So check that out. Okay, but next, thoughts on Andrew Tate and the manosphere? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh, I mean, Andrew Tate, or also, do you remember Tay, AI bot from Microsoft?
No.
I mean, Andrew Tate is just basically like the AI bot Tay that went online and became a neo-Nazi overnight. Not that I'm saying Andrew Tate is. I'm just saying that the algorithm tends to push people to political extremes. If you look at China, the same thing happened in China as it did in the United States, like through polysygamy or like these other kind of like systems where, as Cambridge Analytica kind of like tilts the scales in 2016 towards more conservative people through like psychometrics and all of this. The same thing is happening all over the world, basically. Like if you want to understand like what a 16-year-old is likely to believe, they're going to be in some weird political niche extreme that you could never predict, but you're going to know that it's an extreme and you can't predict what it is. And so schismogenesis gives rise to people that want to have a personality, and that means being really unique and extreme. And have kids. You'll see they may become Andrew Tate. They may become what's the cutest cell guy's name?
I don't know.
I forget his name. They might become an incel. They might become this SJW. They might become Camille Paglia, the anti-trans man. So
My theory is that, I mean, speaking of the algorithm, I do think he's a psyop. I think he was put there to radicalize anybody. Because he's like an extreme form of Jordan Peterson. Like, Peterson ultimately, when it comes down to it, is pretty harmless, I think. But I think, like, in order to kind of exacerbate the, like, quote-unquote culture war, like, you want to take anyone who believes in, like, essentialist gender difference and radicalize them, so then you can demonize them and then like totally erase any type of essentialism whatsoever. I don't know. I mean, maybe not.
This reminds me, do you know about like the Russian People's Revolution happening? Like there's like this rebel group within Russia happening right now, and it was started by like this right-wing neo-Nazi who like was like, I'm gonna make the world more neo-Nazi by starting a clothing brand called like White Rex, I believe. I think his name's like Nikidia. Anyway, so he started a rebel faction on the Russian side, and so basically It's like when Alexander Dugin, are you aware?
Yeah.
Okay. He was on 60 Minutes, like 10 years ago, or maybe even more recent, and he's like, the thing that the people of other countries do not understand about Eurasia is that we want Putin to be more fascist. From below, the people demand that he become more fascist. And you would think that that's like bullshit, and like that, Dugin's just saying this for like, to kind of like in a Zizekian way troll, but like, and then you see this like neo-Nazi group that are like upset with Russia, and they're like to the right of Putin. And so like they're the ones that are causing the rebellion. It's not like some kind of like, I would have expected it to actually be like a cosmopolitan faction of Russia that has been, financially and monetarily hit by the war, who never wanted to be a part of this, that never wanted Russia to isolate. They always wanted Russia to, continue to open its borders and to make their metropolitan cities more cosmopolitan. And so basically, instead, it's like it's this neo-Nazi faction that, first they wanted to, spread their message through a fashion brand. Now they're doing it through a rebel faction in Russia. And so that's the best PR, if you're wondering. Obviously, if this guy's doing it, you should do it as well. So
okay, interesting. So this is kind of a throwback to one of the first Neoliberal Hell podcasts. You talked about otherkin, transspeciesism, we could also say. I'm wondering, do you think we're on the verge of a transracial moment? Like, do you think that's going to start to become like more like the Rachel Dolezals or the Ollie Londons? Like, is this going to become more pervasive at a certain point?
I mean, I think because extreme personalities and identities are just what once was like a social aberration now is every social aberration becomes absorbed by the system, by endless, duplication and division. So, I mean, I think it's just, it may not happen in the next decade, but it's definitely going to happen. I mean, as people talk about how gender is a social construction, they're going to talk about how race is, and it's obviously way more charged. And I'm not for or against it, but I think that the more radical factions of the left would say like, well, we need white abolition, and like abolishing whiteness is a form of transracialism. And then, forms of the right will say like, well, if you really believe that that being white is more powerful, then I'm going to become more white or something like that. At least this is kind of like the position that Ollie London is doing, except he believes that being Asian is giving him more power, I guess, in some kind of way, because he's obsessed with K-pop people. So.
Yeah, I mean, I'm still a little hung up on the cognitive dissonance of, like, pro-transgender, anti-transracial, in the sense that, like, right now, a Rachel Dolezal is a cultural appropriator. Like, she's on the wrong side. Personally, I do think it's, like, intellectually consistent to say, okay, like, if identity is self-determined, it should extend beyond gender to racial identity, even to our species in a way. I mean, sure, that's a little more outlandish, but I don't know. Because I also think about, like, when I think about my upbringing, growing up in, like, a very monolithic suburban environment where, like, identity is something super abstract, like, again, very much pulled up from the roots. And that's why, for me, like, gender identity was very confusing, because being a male was never integrated into some concrete reality. It's purely performative. So if I have an interest that fits into a girl box, then, like, that must mean my identity is female. But the same goes for ethnic or racial identity, because, again, like, being in a very bourgeois, bureaucratic suburban environment, being Greek and Italian, there's no concrete way to express that. It's very, up in the air. So if I like black culture, if I like Japanese culture, shouldn't that mean that I'm also black or Japanese? Like, sure, it's more complex than I'm making it out to be, but I'm just saying, like, at a certain point we have to realize there's this level of cognitive dissonance that, like, I think it has to be addressed. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea that when Clarence like, say that Clarence Thomas, makes a statement about Black Lives Matter, and he says that, it's harmful to Black people. And, you've seen a lot of Black conservatives say these things. Some people would say, like, well, this is a form of whiteness, and he's enacting this form of whiteness as a Black person. So this is kind of like the left critique of that, which I think a lot of people on the left may not agree with. They would agree maybe that this is some form of whiteness, but even people have an issue with this construction of whiteness being decoupled from white people in itself. But a lot of radical people I know say this very often and want to abolish whiteness. But I don't know about the cognitive dissonance element because, of course, I don't think the categories are equal, gender and race. But I do think it's important to recognize how race is not a series of genes. Often we associate race with just two things, like facial features and skin color, but really it's far more complicated. If you saw the latest, we talked about this on the episode, like the census updated there to be multiple races, and everyone is multiple, not everyone, but a lot of people are in the other category for a long time in the census where they're more than one race, and so it gets really complicated really fast with race. And yeah, it's hard to deal with this much complexity in a political environment that wants to reduce everything down to a soundbite.
So one more hot take. Election 24 predictions.
It's interesting how we see, we have basically two horseshoe candidates on the left. We have Marianne Williamson, and then we have Kennedy. And so Williamson and Kennedy are basically, we see Kennedy as kind of like the gray zone candidate. He opposes lockdowns and, the vaccine, but he's like for Medicare for all, and he's for like education for all, these kinds of things. And then you kind of have like the more kind of like SJW, New Age, kind of outsider candidate, Marianne Williamson, who represents kind of like the hippie LA left that seems also disenchanted and maybe in secret is against vaccines, but they wouldn't say that out loud, but basically we have two candidates that are more or less, against, the vaccine mandate. And so it's a little bit of an odd position because basically Biden is now seen as like the rationalist candidate, and the only alternatives are people that are, of this emerging horseshoe category that nobody is willing to even talk about in the media. And so basically it's a holdout. There's like no coverage really happening. There's no debate because the whole strategy is basically just to make it so Biden never has to go on camera or speak, because when he does, he's often befuddling. And then the Trump and DeSantis thing is also a weird standoff too, where it's like DeSantis all of a sudden is like polling badly and is not even sure if he's going to run. It's so, it's so late to run. And all the other candidates just don't seem realistic. So it seems like Biden and Trump are going to go at it again. Trump may, be arrested in Georgia. Who knows? So I guess we'll have to see.
Yeah, because, I feel like DeSantis is, in a way, emulating this, like, amoral, decadent, Trumpian vibe, but gets it completely wrong, because back to, like, the cringe-based, sincere, ironic kind of paradigm, Trump is, like, pure irony. There's nothing sincere. He's pure camp artifice, which is what makes him compelling, gives him some semblance of credibility, whereas DeSantis is, like, overly earnest. Like, he acts as if he really believes all these things, and I'm like, this is where you go wrong. Like, the only good thing about Trump is that he doesn't believe in anything. And this is where, again, like, in a similar way to Matty Healy or to Red Scare, like, his artificiality holds up a mirror to us. It's because he doesn't care that we're able to understand something substantial. Whereas DeSantis, it's like, you have no moral consistency at all, and you act as if you are very, you're standing up for traditional moral values. Like, no, there's nothing valuable about it.
Right,
Yeah.
totally. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, going back to Weber, it's interesting because basically Trump is the charismatic leader, and DeSantis is representing the legal rationalist leader, supposedly. He was a member of the deep state as he was on Guantanamo Bay, is likely, working from that knowledge of deep bureaucracy still. And he seems like the more rationalist person. And he seems like he scares a lot of people on the left because he seems like if he was elected, he would actually be able to, wield state power in a way that Trump never could because, he's too much of an outsider. And it just shows the difference between Trump, who has, he's high class but low status. He's low status. He's always been hated, like, for instance, in Manhattan. Low status here, but he has lots of money. And so he plays the proletarian populist role as a person who's very rich, and he plays that role because he's alienated from being able to become prestigious within that role of being a rich person. But it's actually the opposite. Basically, he was given all this privilege and just fucked it up, and now he's like doing the best he can. Whereas like DeSantis is basically who the Republicans want, and it's because he would be, like a one-to-one with Biden, and if he was elected, we would probably see a reuniting of the Republican Party once again. But if not, we will continue to see the splitting that had been happening on the left for a long time. So,
yeah. So, all right. So with that, anything you want to plug for listeners before we go?
I'm writing a piece for Dazed right now. It's not confirmed, but I'm writing a piece on the NPCC moment. It's related to the ambient polity. And then, check out our podcast, Neoliberal Hell podcast. That's about it, yeah.
Awesome. Well, Matt, thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, totally. Thanks for having me, Stephen.